Black Lives Matter. If you hear nothing else, hear me say, Black Lives Matter. Black lives matter to God. Black dreams matter to me. Black joy matters to our community. And black lives should mean something for you. I know it is tempting for many to say, yes, but all lives matter. And yet the sinful fact remains that all lives are not given the same value or dignity or worth. The continued history in our nation, from slavery to Jim Crow to segregation to the civil rights era, cannot be reduced to history because it is not behind us. Racism is the entrenched waters that we are living in. As a nation, our original sin never went away, and black and brown bodies continue to be used and abused for the sake of the white status quo. In a time of pain and struggle, it was written in Exodus that God heard the cries of the oppressed. In the midst of their bondage and pain and struggle, they cried out and God heard them. But more than that, it's written that God moved towards them. God took care of them. God brought them liberation and freedom. Throughout the Gospels, time and again, Jesus tells us, if you want to know where God is, look to the margins. Look to those that are oppressed, because God will bring them joy. God is found there. So if God is found in those places, let us think about where God is found right now. As of March 31st of this year, the Iowa prison population was 8,519 persons. If you're wondering, the state capacity for our prison system is 6,933. In Iowa, we average an incarceration rate of nearly 600 individuals per every 100,000 persons. This includes all of our jails and prisons, immigration detention centers, and juvenile facilities. As of 2010, it was estimated that usually 18,000 people are detained in Iowa at any given moment. Since 1978, our state incarceration rate has more than doubled, which means in Iowa, on average, we incarcerate nearly 3 times more people than the United Kingdom. This matters because black and brown persons represent less than 10% of the population of our state, and yet they are nearly 40% of our prison population. 3% of the population in Iowa is black, and yet 25% of the prison population is black. It is wildly disproportionate, not because more crimes are committed by black or brown persons, but because they are persecuted at much more harsh rates than white persons. It is the difference between getting a warning or getting a speeding ticket. It's the difference between getting a ticket or getting a summons to court. And that brings about differences in sentencing and parole eligibility as well. When I was in middle school, I did a number of things that were stupid, and a lot of things that were illegal as well. This is going to date me a little bit, but once a friend and I went to a Sam Goody store to get some CDs. CDs aren't really bought in stores anymore, and Sam Goody stores don't exist either. But we didn't have money for these CDs, so we decided we would just steal them. As we started to open the cases so we could slip the CDs into our pockets, we were caught by a store clerk who told us to leave. We were not detained, the police were not called, our parents were not informed. We were just escorted out of the store and told not to come back. One time in high school, some friends and I, after class, were smoking in a clearing in the woods. A police helicopter circled overhead and watched us smoke for about 15 minutes. We then walked to one of my friend's houses, and as we made the turn to the nicer side of town, we noticed that the helicopter got a little farther away, and by the time we were inside, the helicopter was flying to the other side of town. I have been pulled over with a broken taillight when I did not have my driver's license with me, let alone my insurance card. I had nothing, and the police officer sent me on my merry way. Multiple times in my life, when I have done things that were not quite legal or blatantly illegal, I have been given a second chance because of the color of my skin and nothing more than that. My personal anecdotes aside, just think about how we have changed our views on addiction, especially if you compare how we as a nation talk about crack and talk about opioid addiction. In the 80s, crack meant you were an addict, and because it was primarily vilified in the news as a black problem, it led to mandatory minimum sentences and felonies that are still on people's records today. But opioid addiction has primarily been a white problem. And instead of being felons, instead of being automatically sentenced to nearly your life in prison, we talk about rehab and compassion. And while crack and opioid are very close to the same chemicals, how we treated people in the 80s and how we treat people today is different, not because of the drugs, but because of the communities they come from and the colors of their skin. As of 2017, in Iowa, the poverty rate among African Americans was 36%, compared to a state average of 12%. At the very same time, the average median income of an African American family in Iowa was just over $31,000, while the state average income is nearly $70,000 for a family. Nearly 74% of African Americans in Iowa live in rental properties, while the corresponding rate for the rest of the state is just under 30%. This disparity in housing and economic stability combined with unemployment and underemployment has led to a widening of the gap between the income and the economic viability of black communities and everyone else in Iowa and around the nation. If all lives matter, then why do we matter so differently? Why are our average lives so divergent from one another? This is why we have to say again and again and again that black lives matter. Because far too often statistics show that we as a nation and as a state and as a people don't really act like they do. The theologian Monica Coleman, she writes that salvation is the insurrectionary and the revolutionary process of challenging the status quo and demanding equality and inclusion. This echoes some words that come from early Methodist history and John Wesley, when Wesley wrote, "By salvation, I mean not barely according to the vulgar notion of deliverance from hell or going to heaven, but a present deliverance from sin." The pain and the struggle that we are seeing in our nation right now is not simply about the tragic and unnecessary murder of yet another black man dying while saying, "I can't breathe," to people that were supposed to protect and serve him. What we are seeing is this struggle for present deliverance from sin that brings about equality and inclusion. This struggle is not new. It is a deferred dream that has been deferred for far too long. 99 years ago, on May 31st, a white group of thugs attacked the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They destroyed 1,200 homes, destroyed 35 blocks, and killed an estimate of 300 persons. On May 13th, in 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department bombed the headquarters of the Black Liberation Movement known as MOVE. In an instant, that police bombing killed 11 people. 5 of those murdered were children. 61 homes were destroyed, leaving over 250 persons homeless. According to the NAACP, from 1882 to 1968, 3,446 black persons were lynched in the United States. And while that may seem like a large figure, it is unknown how many black persons were lynched due to record keeping and the reality that numerous racists during that time kept their killings private matters instead of public executions. It's in his book, Black Theology and Black Power, that James Cone bluntly states, certainly the history of black-white relations in this country, from the Civil War to the present, unmistakably shows that as a people, America has never intended for blacks to be free. To this day, in the eyes of most white Americans, the black man remains subhuman. As a white American, I don't want to believe that I see anyone as subhuman. I don't want to believe that I am racist. And yet, if you asked me to live as the average black person does in Iowa, I would not want to give up the power or privilege or status that I have as a white man. In the United Methodist Church, our formal baptismal and membership vows ask us this question. Do you accept the freedom and power that God gives you to resist evil and injustice and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? It is one thing not to be racist. It is another for us to be actively anti-racist. We have to resist evil and injustice and oppression not only when we see it in the world, but when we recognize it in ourselves. And so one step that I would invite you to take with me is by taking a course on implicit bias. There are numerous prejudices that we have just under the surface, and too often for white folks like myself, they go unexamined. The General Commission on Religion and Race of the United Methodist Church put together a resource that can be found in the comments of this post and can also be found on faithlead.org. We have to know the evil and injustice that is within us if we are going to rid ourselves of it. But just knowing, just doing it once is not enough. That's why I want to close with a quote from Scott Wood, because starting this conversation, having this chat right now does not mean that we have come anywhere close to the finish line. We are just getting started, and we have to continually resist evil and injustice and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Scott Wood says, "The problem is that white people see racism as conscious hate when racism is bigger than that. Racism is a complex system of social and political levers and pulleys that was set up generations ago and continue working on behalf of whites at the other people's expense, whether or not whites know it or like it. Racism is an insidious cultural disease. It is so insidious that it doesn't care if you are a white person who likes black people. It is still going to find a way to infect how you deal with people who don't look like you. Yes, racism looks like hate, but hate is just one manifestation. Privilege is another. Access is another. Ignorance is another. Apathy is another, and so on. So while I agree with people who say no one is born racist, it remains a powerful system that we are immediately born into. It is like being born into air. You take it in as soon as you breathe. It is not a cold that you can get over. There is no anti-racist certification class. It is a set of socioeconomic traps and cultural values that are fired up every time we interact with the world. It is a thing you have to keep scooping out of the boat of your life to keep from drowning in it. I know it is hard work, but it is the price that you pay for owning everything. We have to do this work of resisting evil and injustice and oppression in whatever forms present themselves. Our God is a God of the oppressed, a God who hears the cries of the needy, the cast aside, the abused, and the lost. If Jesus tells us we need to care for the least of these, then we have to do all that we can to care for our black siblings in this moment. So I hope you will join me in continually resisting evil and injustice and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Amen.